Welcome back, guys, to another episode of the Health Mastery Show. Today marks a week since I've been in a calorie surplus for over a year, or at least a sustained calorie surplus. It's been a week since I finished my competition season, and I can say that I'm feeling a lot better. I'm quite a bit heavier, about maybe 10 pounds heavier, but I also have a lot more energy. Today's guest is quite fitting for that, in fact, because I have on with me JUMA IRAKI. JUMA is the owner and founder of IRAKI Nutrition. He's a certified personal trainer, and he holds the IOC diploma in sports nutrition and a master's degree in sports nutrition. He also currently lectures in sports nutrition for the Academy of Personal Training in Norway. Now, JUMA recently released or published a paper along with Eric Helms, Sergio Espinar, Peter Fishin, and himself on nutrition recommendations for bodybuilders in the off-season and narrative review. And this paper essentially looks at recommendations for bodybuilders for nutrition and supplements in the off-season, which is something that we haven't seen before. We have had a paper, I believe, in 2014 or 15 by Eric Helms and co. on recommendations for dieting phases, but nothing for actual bulking phases. So this is a pretty great episode, and without further ado, let's get into the episode with JUMA IRAKI.
Thanks, Adam. It's a pleasure to be here. I really look forward to the topics we're going to cover today.
Yeah, so before we kind of get into it, the topics that we're going to cover today are really around this recent paper or review that you had released with Peter Fishin, Sergio Espinar, and Eric Helms. So nutrition recommendations for bodybuilders in the off season. So when we're talking about bodybuilders, we mean natural bodybuilders or basically anybody who kind of wants to optimize their overall muscle size and not get fat, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, perfect. So do you want to give you a quick intro, or just 10-second intro into yourself, how you became to where you are right now, and then what led you to actually doing this review?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a personal trainer based in Oslo, Norway. I have a master's degree in sports nutrition and the IOC diploma in sports nutrition. So basically, I run a company called IRAKI Nutrition, where I do lectures for personal trainers. I do guest speaking. I do online coaching for mostly physique athletes. And I also work as a consultant for a big supplement company here in Norway.
Great, thanks a lot. So let's jump right into it. So this whole kind of review was simply based around, and it's not really something that has been discussed before. I know that I think it might have been 2013 or 15 that Eric Helms, as well as a few others, I can't remember exactly now, but they did recommendations for natural bodybuilders for contest or for getting lean, but we never really had anything around recommendations for off-season or building muscle. And it's definitely something that we need, because everybody wants to build muscle, and most people probably need to build muscle more so than they need to lose fat, or at least that's the goal. But we kind of don't really have a clear guide, or we didn't at least, of what the recommendations are from an overall point of view in terms of actually what's achievable, because sometimes people, they underestimate, I guess, what they can achieve, but then also they kind of think that they can gain faster than they can, if that makes sense. So the whole kind of dreamer bulk, and from my experience, I know that I've been through several bulks and cuts, not just inside of, or not just in the realm of competing, because I think this is my third contest season now since I was 21, so every 3 years or so. But even outside of that, I've done some cuts, and often in between those cuts or deficits, I'm trying to build muscle. But most of the time what happened, at least when I was younger, was that I would just get super, super fat, and I would get to the point where it would be a long cut, and then after the cut, I'd be like, okay, I want to gain some muscle, and then I didn't actually do a proper structured bulk or phase where I was actually gaining long enough to gain significant muscle, because I would just cut and then get fat, and then be like, okay, I'm fat enough now, I need to cut again.
Yeah, so basically spinning your wheels in a sense by doing that, because I think I see this specific problems I see with a lot of people, that maybe they start with too much body fat and they start gaining, and then suddenly they're not comfortable with the body fat levels that they suddenly have because they gain too fast, and then they do a cut, and then they might feel that, oh, I don't look as big as I used to be, because they're maybe they're a bit confused about if they actually have sufficient amount of muscles or not, because when you're bulked up, it's easy to feel that way, that you're maybe bigger than what you actually are. So people spend like short times cutting and then short times bulking, and then they're basically not getting off the spot in a sense.
Yeah, actually, just to that point, I mean, people don't realize how much fat they actually have in their body. I think people think that they have significantly more muscle than they do. Even me, who it's been my goal for, let's say, the last 10 years to build as much muscle as I can naturally. And obviously, like I said, I haven't been as efficient as I could have with those kind of cuts and bulks, but still, with that in mind, I've still been trying to gain as much muscle as I can naturally. And even in my last, or even in this current, say I'm in the middle of a contest prep, I've competed about 3 weeks ago, I'm lighter than what I would have expected. So when I first competed, when I was 21, I think I started my cut in pounds around 210 pounds. I was pretty chubby, but I was like, when I get to 185, I am going to be shredded on stage. And now it's now it's 6 years later, and I'm 10 pounds lighter. I'm 175, and I'm still not as lean as I would like to be. So if you think about me as what people would consider obsessed bodybuilder, the average person, they think that they'll lose 15 pounds or 5 to 10 kilos and they're going to be ripped, they're going to get abs. But in reality, that's not the case. And like you said, they'll lose a bit of weight, and it'll be probably like intramuscular fat or visceral fat, which comes off first, and then they are getting leaner, but they just don't see that subcutaneous fat come off, and they're just like, I'm just losing muscle, and then they go and bulk again, and it just becomes this cycle where they don't feel like they're actually ever making progress.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the reasons why, like initially this started as the paper was actually an assignment that I did for the IOC diploma. And Eric Helms is a very good friend of mine. We spoke a lot, and I introduced the idea for him that, hey, there's a lot of focus on pre-contest, but there's basically little literature on what bodybuilders or physique athletes should do in the off season. There's basically one paper that I know of from Lambert, published in 2004, where they had some recommendations for off season, but it didn't really go into depth in the way that we did, because we basically went into the specifics of energy, macronutrient distribution, timing, supplements, etc., etc. So we covered a lot of topics, and one thing that surprised me was there basically wasn't anything on this. And considering that most physique athletes probably spend 70% of their career in the off season, it's not really in pre-contest that they spend their time. So I think it was important to get a paper out on this topic, also because a lot of the nutrition practices often used by bodybuilders and physique athletes, they lack scientific support. So there needs to be something that we can recommend for this population, which also takes into consideration that it's not detrimental to their health. Because if you look at a lot of the papers that came out in the 80s and 90s on bodybuilders, they have very restricted eating patterns, which also led to a lot of deficiencies in micronutrients. Luckily, we have a new generation now that has a better grasp on variation when it comes to nutrition, and they don't have this fixed idea that you need to eat chicken, rice, and broccoli to get shredded. You can actually eat a lot more variation in your diet and still get super lean for competitions. So there was a lot of things regarding that made this topic important. And like we initially talked about, It's not really relevant only for bodybuilders and physique athletes. It's also relevant for people that want to gain like quality lean tissue, and how you should progress as you go in those phases, because a lot of people, they start too aggressively with their so let's say you start the first month of bulking and you're already 5 kilos up in weight. If you continue doing that over an extended period of time, like gaining 20 kilos in 4 months, there's not a whole lot of that's going to be quality mass. You're just probably gaining way excess of fat mass, which at some point you have to take off, and in the process of doing that, you risk losing the muscle you gained during that phase. So the net muscle gain that you have after first bulking and cutting can be significantly low if you keep doing that without trying to pace yourself and do this in a more scientific way.
Yeah, and I think that this is a question that I got off a couple of clients before, is like, do you think that I can maximize my muscle mass or the gain of muscle mass if I push the calories a little bit higher? And what my response would be, well, maybe you can get, you can squeeze out a little bit excess muscle gain with a lot of extra fat. But the only issue is, like you said, when you go down to cut, and invariably we've seen in natural natural athletes or natural lifters that you always are going to lose some lean mass, and the more body fat you have means the longer you have to diet, and the higher chance you are at that risk of losing that excess muscle. So even if you gained a little bit extra muscle, the chances are that you're going to be losing that extra muscle because you have to got the diet a little bit longer, and you may even lose it a little bit more than if you had taken it in a shorter period, or a longer approach to the bulk, because you're just in the deficit for a longer period of time.
Absolutely.
So with regards to, I suppose, lean bulking or energy intake, we always hear people talk about, well, it's a lean bulk, I'm going on a lean bulk, or I'm going to like a normal bulk. But in reality, it seems that the only way, or the only thing that you can do, is a lean bulk. So the recommendations that you've given is a 10 to 20% increase in your maintenance calories, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
So one thing, I guess, that I would ask is that as we start to increase calories, and let's say someone's transitioning from a cutting phase to a bulking phase, their non-exercise activity thermogenesis is going to go up, so they'll actually eat more calories, but they won't gain any additional weight. So is that a moving average, or how does one kind of calculate that number?
Well, it's basically a starting point, and then you basically adjust the calories based on the target weight gain you have of body weight per week. So it's correct what you're saying, that most people, when they actually increase their calories, they'll see that, well, I bumped up my calories this much, but by bumping up the calories, thermic effect of food went up, and you might started being more active due to NEAT. So basically the caloric surplus gets eaten up by the excess amount of energy that you're expending. So it's basically a starting point, and then based on the target of weight gain you have per week, you would adjust or subtract calories from that based on if you're going too fast or too slow with the weight gain. So what I typically recommend is most of my physique clients, we basically coming out of a pre-contest phase, a dieting phase, we basically do things. We cut back on cardio if you were doing excess amount of cardio during the cutting phase. And we, based on how much cardio they were doing, we might just cut back on the cardio and increase by 10 to 15%. In most cases, I do say 10 to 20, but I do 10 to 15 based on the amount of cardio, and adjust based on that. And then we start to do daily weigh-ins that we also do pre-contest, and we basically adjust based on the gains that we're seeing. It's always expected that you gain faster coming out of a contest diet. And I think it's good to allow quicker gains the first couple of weeks, just to get you more in a physical and mental state that is better, because I don't think people that's never competed really understand how taxing it can be to the system, both physically and mentally, by being super low with body fat, compared to, like, if you, let's say you were a drug using bodybuilder, you would have the hormones would be there, so it wouldn't have a suppressive effect. So it's actually more, in a sense, it's more taxing to the body doing bodybuilding competitions naturally, because it takes a while to normalize testosterone levels and other various hormones. There's actually one study that showed that approximately it takes the amount of time you were dieting until everything is normalized after a competition.
Yeah, and I think I would agree and disagree with you on that one. So obviously, like, you're taking, if you're a unnatural or enhanced bodybuilder or physique athlete, you'll be taking testosterone, so that'll be there. But things like ghrelin and leptin levels would still be pretty closely correlated to your body fat levels. So I think, right, so if you're super lean, let's say 5% body fat, and even if your testosterone, like mine is probably tanked right now because I'm a natural competitor, but somebody who's, like, let's say they're using testosterone, and but their leptin, right, they're still going to be starving, and they're still going to have the drive to eat. So I can see on paper how the approach that you take would work, but from a psychological point of view, do you find that it's difficult for people to kind of stick to that? Because I know for myself, and not just because I'm a natural competitor, but like I'm pretty low calories. I mean, around 10 grams or 10 calories per pound of body weight. So like I'm like 175, and I'm eating around 1700 calories, but I'm also doing a lot of activity. So like I track steps. And if you told me that, like, okay, next week we're going to finish our diet, but all we're going to do is stop doing the cardio or reduce that, I would be like, give you two middle fingers. Like, man, I want to eat. I want to eat. I don't want to be eating like
okay. Yeah, sorry. That's not what I meant, just cutting the cardio. It was cutting the cardio combined with increasing the calories. What I meant was the range is 10 to 20, but if we're doing excess amount of calories, I wouldn't like bump it up to 20 right away. I might just bump it up between 10 and 15% and then cut back on the cardio. Because it wouldn't make sense to just cut out the cardio, because you would still like be suppressing a lot of things. But one of the biggest challenges I see with clients coming out of competition is once they start eating, it's very difficult to hold back on the food. Like, it just spins off, because suddenly the body notices that now it's more energy available to consume, and it just want to fill up, and you're basically never satiated. Like, you just want to eat. So one of the strategies I do is actually I bump up the protein intake pretty high due to the satiating effects of protein, and that seems to work with, I'm not saying it works with everyone, but most of the clients I've done this with give me feedback that it's been easier to control their eating coming out of a contest when the protein is much higher. It makes complete sense, even when you're in a cutting phase, right? So if you just simply swap out some carbohydrates for extra protein and all calories equal, that can help with hunger. So not necessarily for the muscle building effect. So some people will say, oh, I'm already eating 1 gram per pound of body weight or 2.2 grams per kilo. Like, I don't need any more, and it's more from that satiety aspect. And like, but you're hungry all the time, and you're binging, so we need to increase protein, but we still need to maintain a deficit somehow, so you keep losing weight. But what kind of levels do you bump protein up? So what would your normal recommendations be? And then in this kind of transition from a cutting phase to a bulking phase, how high would it get? Hey guys, I hope you're enjoying the podcast with JUMA IRAKI and taking some valuable information away from this.
If you are enjoying it, please go over and do leave a rating and review on whatever platform you're listening on this to, because it helps a lot with the algorithms and helps me get better guests on in the future and keep this podcast going. So without further ado, let's get back to the episode with JUMA IRAKI.
It depends basically on how hungry the person are, but in some cases I bump it up to usually I have people around 2.4 2.5 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight in pre-contest phase. I actually might bump that up to 3 grams in the initial weeks following the transition phase, just to keep the satiating effects from the proteins there. And then as that slows down, we will slowly adjust proteins back to normal levels. One thing that we didn't mention that's very important to mention is the calorie recommendations that we gave from 10 to 20% should also be based on how experienced you are. So let's say you're a novice bodybuilder or someone that's never lifted weights again, you can allow for a bigger caloric surplus. But as you get more advanced, it's probably a good idea to taper both the caloric surplus but also the target weight gain per week, because as you get more advanced, you basically won't be able to add on muscle mass as quickly as it was when you initially started lifting. There's no papers that I know of that basically looked at like average amounts of muscle mass you can gain the first year, but I know McDonald has some numbers on that, and a few other people as well. And approximately what most of the people say regarding how much you can gain naturally for a male is around 10 kilograms of muscle mass the first year you train, and then half of that amount for every year after that. So let's say when you're on your 4th, 5th year of consistent training, you're probably not going to see a lot of gains there compared to the first couple of years when you were training. So it just makes sense that the caloric surplus shouldn't be as big when it's not going to be possible to gain as much muscle mass anyway.
Yeah, that sucks really, and it's not something that people want to hear. But like I said, I competed about 3 weeks ago at the Natural Muscle Mayhem, and there's a pro division there, and some of the guys on stage, you know, they compete, and let's say 5 years in between competitions, they're literally like 1 pound or half a kilo difference, and these guys are, you know, touching their 40s, some of them. So like it literally slows down to an almost halt the time you get, like when you start to get like much more advanced. And even for me, I noticed that the last time I got super lean was 2016, albeit I am leaner this time, but I'm actually 10 pounds lighter this time. And if I was to say to somebody, or if I was to look at myself or talk to myself in 2016 and say in 3 years time you're gonna be 10 pounds lighter, I'd be like, what? So I'm lighter by 10 pounds? Like, that sucks. But I mean, it's when you're doing this naturally, you really gotta kind of have this stoic mindset of delayed gratification. But I think a lot of people probably think that they're closer to their genetic potential than they actually are, because if you're not an actual competitive bodybuilder or physique athlete, most people are probably not in that advanced stage, right? So how would you consider, or what would define a beginner, an intermediate, and an advanced trainee?
That's a great question, and I think a lot of people like disagree maybe on the way do you define it. Some people say, well, it's basically how many years you've been training, but as you probably know, there's people at the gym that's been training there for 10 years and they look exactly the same. So I wouldn't go by how many years you've been training. I would go by muscular development and basically strength levels. That's what I use to determine if someone is novice, intermediate, or advanced when it comes to bodybuilders.
So give me some numbers in terms of the strength, because muscular development is kind of subjective, right? Based off like how your structure is and stuff. But unless we're calculating fat-free mass index, but like that just gets a bit messy with body fats and stuff. But with strength, it's pretty interesting. I've never heard somebody use that as a terminology for like how advanced you are, because the powerlifters, some are pretty strong but not that big. But in the general kind of bodybuilding population, it probably does make sense. So what would you say for, like, you know, beginner, intermediate, advanced? Do you look at like the squat, bench, deadlift, or are you looking at bicep curls?
No, it's basically the main lifts, and it has more to do with the progression of weights you've been doing over the years. And like, let's say squats, I would define somebody who can do double body weight in squat as somebody who's, it's not world class, but you're getting to an advanced level when you can do double body weight in squats, or triple your body weight in deadlifts, for example. But it's not like absolute numbers that if you're doing 150 kg in bench press, you're advanced. It's more of the progression from where you started and where you're at now that I personally use as determined, combined with, of course, the muscular development of this person. And especially if we have numbers that we can look at from previous years and where they started from initially.
Yeah, and I think it's great, and it's something that people need to kind of keep in mind as well, is that, you know, you need to be really consistent with this and making actual, like you said, it's not absolute numbers, but the progression that you've made. So for me, if I think back the last couple of years, I haven't really had a productive off season where I'm taking it as serious as my contest prep. Not that I want to be as granular with certain things like nutrition, but I haven't necessarily always planned out my training and tried to beat the logbook and try to progressively overload on everything. Sometimes I just went in there and I kind of just trained for the fun of it, and trained hard, but not with the goal of progression. So that's something that I'm definitely going to be focusing on. But to come back to the paper that we talked about, nutrition specifically, we talked about that kind of 10 to 20%. Do you think there's any benefit to going above that, or after that, is it pretty much all fat?
Like, these are like guidelines numbers. So let's say you're dealing with somebody who's really having a hard time putting on weight, you can definitely go above that. But like I said, I think people overestimate how much or how fast they can build muscle. So if you're planning on putting on 20 kg in 4 months and thinking that all of that would be muscle, you're really gonna have a hard time with maybe not just getting the fat off, but also be disappointed by how little muscle mass actually got gained during that phase. I don't know how your approach is to it, but what I usually do is I like to recycle weights, like I call them. So we'll have, for example, if I have a person that's in the off season around, let's say 80 kg at 10% body fat, for example. Usually what I do is I like to have like 3 months where we focus on gaining slowly, and then based on how much their body fat levels increased, we'll have a shorter cutting phase where we can get body fats level to drop. And the goal is to, over time, make those 80 kg improve better for each time. So usually we'll just have like a focus on, let's say, on average we'll have a target of maybe gaining 5 kgs over a 3-month period, and we try to always improve every time we're gaining. We're trying to improve the quality of that weight for each time. For me, it's been more beneficial to do that with clients because it seems to be that the system or the body is more sensitive to actually putting on lean tissue, because we're not allowing body fat levels to increase too high. The downside of having body fats increase too high is that you're running the risk that the nutrients that you're putting into the body, if you're in a energy surplus, that more of that is going towards body fat storage. So optimally, I don't really like people to be much higher. Like, I put a maximum limit of 20% body fat in the offseason, and that's pushing it. If you ask me, I much rather say to people, like, try to maximum get body fat levels up to 15-16%, and when you reach that body fat level, you should probably do a shorter cut just to get some of the body fat levels down again.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Like, insulin sensitivity just starts to get kind of messed up in the muscles, and you just kind of, everything, if it's not going into the muscle, it has to be going somewhere, so you just get fatter. But yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that, and I see this all the time anecdotally, that people, they think that they can gain muscle a lot faster than they actually can, but then when they see somebody who's taken it slow, but has taken it slow for multiple years, they'll be like, oh, that guy's not natural, he's definitely on steroids. I'm like, but he only gained like 10 kilos over the last 15 years. How is it, like, you know, you want to gain 10 kilos in 1 year? You know, it's funny that the way people think about it. I saw a great quote, I think it was from Lane Norton a couple of years ago. He's like, people, they overestimate what they can achieve in 1 year, but they underestimate what they can achieve in 10 years.
Yeah.
So we kind of talked about the overall energy intake and kind of the surplus recommendations, body fat, you know, the higher level that you like to get to. But what's the kind of rate of gain that someone should look for? Is it a couple of kilos per month, or is it, does it depend on your overall, you know, it's level? If there's a beginner, intermediate, advanced, we kind of touched on that a little bit, but what's the kind of, do you have any numbers that people should be looking at, and what way do you track that?
We have numbers based on percentages of your body weight. So what we recommend is a target weight gain of 0.25 to a 0.5% gain of body weight per week. So say you're intermediate or novice, you should probably aim at 0.5% of your body weight per week. But if you're on the advanced level, it's probably wise to aim for the lower number. So if you're 100 kg, just for easy math, we're looking at 1 kg increase for an advanced bodybuilder per month to put on. So the way I would track that is basically look at average weight per week, like do daily weigh-ins, take an average of that and see how much you're actually gaining per week. If you're spot on, you just continue with the surplus that you have. If it's starting to creep up much higher than that, it's probably a good idea to cut a bit back on the calories and stay on the target weight gain.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And just as a kind of a side note, I suppose, do you think for like our enhanced brothers and sisters, do you think that, you know, the weight of rate gain could be a lot faster for those? I'm sure it obviously is, but do you have any kind of data around that or potential insights into, you know, how fast they could actually gain?
Like there is a couple of papers on it. You're probably familiar with some of the studies from Bazin. Have you heard any of those papers?
I haven't. No, I actually haven't really looked much into research on anabolics. It just, to be honest, it's not my forte. But I do like to kind of compare. An actual enhanced bodybuilding is my favorite to watch. I just love to watch those freaks.
Yeah. So Bazin was a researcher that I think it was published in 1996, where he actually took a group of men, divided them into 4 groups, and one group didn't train, got a placebo. The other group didn't train, got 600 milligrams of testosterone weekly. One group got placebo and trained, and then the last group trained and got 600 milligrams of testosterone.
Yeah, no, study, yeah.
Yeah, so if I remember correctly, I think it was approximately a 6 or 7 kilograms gains of muscle mass during a 10-week period. So you're basically looking at almost a kilo a week of gains when you took 600 milligrams of testosterone with training. Interestingly, in that study, the group that got 600 milligrams of testosterone and didn't train actually had bigger gains than the group that got placebo and did train. So even when you're not training and taking supraphysiological doses of testosterone, you can see some impressive gains with that. And just to put it in context, average male maybe produces about, I think the average is around 5 to 10 milligrams of testosterone daily. So we're looking at average of approximately, like on the higher end, it's 70 milligrams a week. And then you have this group taking 10 times the amount of what's naturally. And even in like bodybuilding context, if you look at the pro level, like 600 milligrams is like considered a beginner's cycle. It's nothing compared to what the pros are using, which are like insane amounts. And I honestly don't understand how they're willing to take that risk with their health, because we're talking about like enormous amounts. And we've had in the last 2 years, I think it's been 3 deaths of very young bodybuilders due to anabolic steroid use.
Yeah, I think Dallas McCarver was one. There's a couple of others as well. I remember when I read that study first. Now that you mentioned the insights to it, I have read that a couple of times. But I was so shocked at the fact that the group who actually trained with weights naturally, so just they had the placebo, they actually gained less muscle than the group who did nothing and didn't train at all, and they took testosterone. It's just insane to think how the effects play a part in actual building muscle. I think obviously it's context dependent, and your sensitivity to it. For people who their first cycle, etc., probably have bigger gains. I don't know, but I'm just throwing stuff out here.
It's like there's one paper that came out, I think it was from Stuart Phillips' lab, McMaster University, where they actually look at it has more to do with like the androgen receptors. Like the more receptors you have, the more benefits you would get from both endogenous and exogenous testosterone. So what that means is that for some people, like if you have very low levels of androgen receptors, even taking anabolic steroids might not give you the benefits that you really want due to the fact. One thing that supraphysiological doses of testosterone does is, in excessive amounts, the body actually make more androgen receptors due to the fact that there's more testosterone circulating in the body. But that's why some people see very good results with very small amounts, and some people can take huge amounts and even then not see the results what they want. Bazine actually did a follow-up study in 2001, which was dose response of testosterone and the increases in strength and muscle mass. And basically what the paper concluded was that the higher amount of testosterone you're taking, the bigger the gains are. They saw, I think they compared placebo, 25 milligrams, 50 milligrams, 125 milligrams, 300 milligrams, and 600 milligrams. And the higher the dosage, the higher the gains, basically, was what was said or what was concluded in that paper.
There you go, folks. You heard it all. Up the dose.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say that. I think one of the things that a lot of people that are considering using this don't take into consideration is we don't really have a lot of research on the long-term effect it has psychologically. So it's basically like when smoking first came out, we didn't really have a lot of research on the negative effects of smoking. But as the year went on, they finally found out that it's actually having a lot of negative effects on our health. But recently there's been more research coming out of actually Norway doing research on the effects of anabolic steroids and the effects that it has on the brain, because now we have a generation that's been using steroids since the 80s and 90s, and where they actually had the opportunity to do MRI scans of their brains and look at of the structure of the brain. And there's some pretty concerning findings from that study that can have long-term significant negative effects on mental health and other related brain diseases. And these usually don't come after a couple of years of drug use. They usually come after sufficient amounts over an extended period of time. But I think that area hasn't got a lot of attention, and cardiovascular disease and other stuff has gotten a lot more attention. But that's also a concern for people that are using illegally anabolic steroids.
Yeah, I mean, we just, like you said, we just don't have the data there because it's illegal. In a lot of countries, it's hard to do those studies. Kind of like with Class A drugs like heroin and cocaine and stuff. Just because of its controlled substances, it's just harder to kind of do it. But I think we're kind of getting a bit off topic, turning this into a pharmacology podcast. But when we go back to the recommendations for nutrition, when it comes to specific macronutrient breakdown, do you have any recommendations, or do you think that, besides the protein obviously, but do you think that, like this study that we had, I think it was last year by out of Stanford with Gartner, where they did a weight loss study or a fat loss study, and they just like low carb versus low fat with matched protein and calories, and they pretty much had the same results. Would you say that's the same for muscle building, or do you have specific recommendations around carbs and fats for muscle building to optimize that?
Great question. So what we've recommended in our paper is for protein aiming for 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight for protein, and fats we've actually recommended to consume in moderate amounts, which is 0.5 to 1.5 grams per kilogram of body weight. And there's a couple of reasons for that, but I think a lot of people overemphasize the effects that dietary fats has on optimizing testosterone levels, because if you actually look at the research, it seems that it has more to do with available body fat on the body and less to do with the amount of fat that you're consuming. And even if you like push the fats really high, you're basically looking at very insignificant gains or increases in natural testosterone levels, which really doesn't mean anything if you're looking to gain muscle mass. So one of the negative effects of consuming really high fat diets, especially if you do it around your training, is it seems to have negative effects on signaling pathways that has to do with remodeling of skeletal muscle, but it also seems to lower insulin sensitivity. So basically you don't utilize carbohydrates as optimally as you should if you're consuming huge amounts of fats. I actually did a cycling study, I think it's 2 years ago now, where we had like high-level cyclists, which was super lean, and we basically gave them a protein and carbohydrate matched diets. One of the group was we glycogen depleted them, and then we basically gave them different amount of energy. So protein and carbohydrate was matched. One of the groups got 30 kilocalories per kilogram of fat-free mass, and the other got 10. So a big difference in energy intake. But what we saw in that study was that when we measured their blood sugar levels at 8 different time points, the high-fat groups actually had signs of insulin resistance due to the high fat diets that we were consuming. And we also did some biopsies, muscle biopsies, which also showed that consuming high fat diets, especially around training, is probably not a good idea if you're trying to optimize insulin sensitivity. So based on the fact that there seems to be more benefits for physique athletes with higher carbohydrates intake, we based our recommendations on a moderate amount of fats, which would allow for more focus on consuming sufficient amounts of carbohydrates. The paper actually recommends, or we basically recommend in our paper, that once you've taken your calories, divided appropriate amount to protein and fats, remaining calories should come from carbohydrate, but you should also focus on consuming sufficient amounts, which we defined from 3 to 5 grams per kilogram of body weight. A lot of people overestimate the amount of carbohydrates that they need based on the training sessions that they do. A lot of people think that, if you do a training session, you've completely depleted your glycogen stores after that session and you need huge amounts of carbohydrates. That's not true. If you look at some of the paper from Tesh and McDougall that came out in the 80s and in the 90s, there's actually one study from Tesh where he had participants do 4 different exercises. I think they did back squats, front squats, leg extensions, leg press, 5 sets for each exercise, and all sets was taken to failure. And after that session, they measured muscle glycogen in the quadriceps, and there was like between a 24 and 40% drop of glycogen stores. So still plenty of glycogen available after that. But if you compare that to endurance sports, you can probably deplete a cyclist. If they did a really hard interval sessions for 2 hours, they would be completely depleted of glycogen stores. Because people forget that when you do resistance training, you do have a lot of breaks between your sets, and when you do that, you can recycle a lot of things which can then be resynthesized to glycogen.
Yeah, I think on top of that as well, often a lot of the exercises that you do, especially in the lower reps, you're not actually using that glycolytic pathway. You're using, the ATP that's stored within the muscle already. So you're doing explosive work that doesn't even necessarily require that much glycogen. You're using the creatine phosphate energy pathway. So, maybe if you're doing super high reps and super high volume, that might increase that glycogen depletion a little bit, but it's not to the point where people would actually think or would hope, because I think most people that do bulk, they want to hear that you got to eat a lot of food and that you can get away with eating a ton of calories, and I certainly want to hear that. I certainly don't want to hear that a 10% increase in my calories is going to be sufficient. I want to go into one of those dreamer bulks again, but unfortunately naturally it's just not possible. But do you have any recommendations then, I suppose, with around the workout? You touched a little bit around trying to limit fat intake, but with regards to protein timing and carbohydrate timing, do you have any preferences, or is the paper specifically, I think it touched on 3 to 6 protein feedings, and that would be kind of in line with what we kind of would believe at the moment. But do you still believe that overall intake for today is going to be most important?
Yeah, when you start to prioritize different things, overall what you consume during the day is the most important thing. But if you're looking to optimize things, I think some of the papers regarding timing that's come out the last couple of years has been maybe misunderstood by a lot of people, because some of the papers say that, well, it's not necessary to consume nutrients post-workout. You can have 1 to 2 hours pre and post training, and that would be sufficient. But on the other hand, it's not like it's going to be detrimental if you actually consume nutrients right after your training session. So the more advanced you are, it's probably going to be more important to consume nutrients right after your training session. And that's basically due to the fact that MPS seems to be shorter, like it's a shorter time frame after a training session where you're in a muscle building state. So it just makes sense that taking advantage of that and consuming nutrients as fast as possible after a training session might be a good idea. But for the general population, like having a meal 1 to 2 hours pre-training and within 1 to 2 hours post-training is a good recommendation to give. But again, there's no reason to wait to consume nutrients after a training session. It's not going to be negative for your results. What I do with fats is, depending on how far you are from your training session, I allow more fats the further the meal is from the training session. So usually I'll say, okay, if you're going to consume a meal that's going to be 1 to 2 hours before the training session, it's a good idea not to only consume something that is low in fat, but also low in fiber, and also something that is easily digestible. Some people have this idea in their head that if you eat chicken, rice, and vegetables 2 hours before a training session, and then you train for an hour, that you're in a catabolic state because it's 3 hours since your last day. That's chicken and rice and vegetable you ate 3 hours ago. It's probably just started to digest and come out in your bloodstream. So if you want something that's gonna give you a benefit before the training session, it's probably a good idea, if you're consuming it that close to the training session, consume something that's easily digestible, especially when it comes to carbohydrates.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, like you said, people think that the anabolic pre and post workout window is a lot more important than especially when you're eating whole foods. So maybe, but probably not, it would have more significance if you're eating maybe faster digesting foods like whey protein. But still, within that context itself, I think that still a couple of hours, it's not going to make any difference, because by the time that like the food gets through the system and starts to break down the small intestine and then into the bloodstream, and you know, your workout is probably like an hour long, so it's probably just peaking towards the end of your workout, and you don't necessarily need to have that shake in the locker room post workout, or like I mentioned before with Alan Aragon, those people who have the tuna in the change rooms, they absolutely drive me crazy. You know, they stink up the whole change rooms just for the fact that they think they need to get it in within that certain window.
Yeah, and I think it's more important to get nutrients in as quickly as possible. Like I said, if you're advanced, trying to maximize your gains, if you're training in a fasted state, or if you're training multiple sessions a day, it's probably a good idea to do that. But it's not that critical if you consumed a meal within 2 hours before the training session. It's not gonna be a problem.
So general recommendations: kind of spread your meals out, 3 to 6 meals. Try and keep fats limited, or at least lower, around your workouts, and you can have higher fat meals throughout the rest of the day, and protein, I guess, evenly spread across those days, or meals, I mean.
Yep.
And in one thing that you touched on in the paper as well is the quality of the protein. So, you know, full spectrum of amino acids. Can you touch a little bit on that?
Yeah, absolutely. There's been this idea that plant-based protein is inferior to animal-based protein. You get more bang for your buck when you're consuming like high quality protein from dairy, for example, like whey protein. But soy protein also has all the essential amino acids, but it's in a lower amount per gram compared to dairy. So, but one thing is that all of the studies, when they compare plant-based and animal-based, they're using the same amounts. But if you were to consume plant-based protein and you increase the amounts a little bit, there's basically no difference in the response that you get for MPS. So generally, if I work with, I'm not saying that I have a lot of vegan clients, but I've had some vegan clients, and my general recommendation is, if you're vegan, it's probably a good idea to bump up the protein, the total protein that you're consuming during the day. And generally, I say bump it up by 15 to 20% on what I would generally recommend.
Yeah, so it's not going to be that significant unless you're, even if you are eating the same amount of protein, it's probably not going to have that much a difference unless you're like a physique athlete and really want to maximize, that muscle protein synthesis.
It's not gonna make a huge difference. And again, when you're consuming like mixed meals, a lot of the studies they don't use mixed meals with different sources. They usually do isolated proteins and then compare that. But the studies that have adjusted for the amounts for plant-based protein do show that as long as you increase the amounts a bit, it basically has the same effect. So basically, just eat more of the plant-based protein, and you would get similar effect as the animal-based proteins.
Okay, got it. Good stuff. And then the final question I have is around supplementation, which often people put, as the number one priority, which needs to be probably pushed down a lot further than people think. But what would your general recommendations be for supplementation for bulking, and are they any different for bulking and cutting, or are they pretty much the same?
It's pretty much the same, to be honest. A lot of people ask when it comes to pre-contest about fat loss supplements, but what you find on the market that's legal is basically a waste of money, to be honest. Caffeine do have some effect that can be beneficial for fat loss, but there's really no difference in what recommendations we have for supplements for pre-contest compared to the off-season. If I were to mention supplements that would be of now we're talking about performance benefits, definitely creatine monohydrate. Not only does it help with strength levels, it also has a lot of benefits on the cellular levels for remodeling of skeletal muscle that can be beneficial. And you don't need a huge amount of creatine. Like a lot of people, they say, well, I'm a big guy, so I'm going to take 10 grams of creatine monohydrate every day. That's a complete waste. There's been a paper by, I think it's Willoughby's lab that did this one, which actually showed that up to 100 kg, 3 grams seems to be more than sufficient to satiate creatine phosphate levels in the body. So 3 grams, if you're above 100 kg, maybe bump that up to 4 or 5. So 3 to 5 grams should be sufficient for most people. Caffeine is also a supplement that is very beneficial. The funny thing with caffeine is that when you look at dietary supplements, they have often benefits specific for different sports and exercises. But caffeine seems to be universal. So basically all physical activity that you do, you would see a benefit from caffeine. If you're doing endurance, if you're doing strength, you see benefits on a lot of different sports. When it comes to recommendations for caffeine intake, it does seem to be beneficial if you use it on the higher end of the recommendation, which we recommend in our paper, aiming for 5 to 6 milligrams per kilogram of body weight, consumed approximately 1 hour before your training session. So it does seem to have a good effect on power output, but also delaying the onset of fatigue when you're training. So those would be my go-to supplements for performance. Beta-alanine and citrulline malate we have recommended in our paper as supplements that can potentially be beneficial depending on if we start with beta-alanine. So basically what beta-alanine does in the body is when it's consumed, you increase the stores of carnosine, which act as a pH buffer in the muscle. So basically what that means is as you're doing your repetitions and you're building up lactate, beta-alanine would maybe give you a couple of extra reps before that lactate kicks in and burns in your muscle. So based on how you train, if you do bodybuilding training with a lot of repetitions, like 10 plus repetition, potentially it can have a benefit. Citrulline is the newest supplement that's gotten a lot of focus in the fitness industry, and what it basically does, it increases nitric oxide production in the body, which increases bloodstream to the muscle. Some studies have showed that you get potentially more strength and increased repetitions while you're training. The latest meta-analysis on that topic, I think it was from Trexler and colleagues.
Yeah, Eric Trexler, yeah.
Yeah, it came out this year. And basically what they concluded with was that potentially it can have a small benefit, but it does seem to have more of a benefit for high-level competitive bodybuilders that are looking for like these small edges and advantages to maximize their results. So it does seem to have more of a benefit for people that are on a higher level. So it wouldn't necessarily be like if you're limited on cash, I would definitely just stick with creatine monohydrate and caffeine. If you have the extra money, you can give beta-alanine and citrulline malate a try and see if you're getting any benefits from that.
Yeah, I think personally I've tried citrulline a number of times, and to be honest, just with the dosages that you need and the cost, I just felt that I'd rather spend my money elsewhere, considering the limited effects that I've got. I've noticed a little bit of maybe a pump, but nothing significant to the point where I'm going to consistently take it. So personally, I don't actually take citrulline or beta-alanine because after having tried them a couple times, I'm just not feeling like I actually get the benefits from them. So I guess, like you said, it has that small effects, and it's probably nowhere near as much as the return on investment you can get from taking caffeine and creatine, which are also way less expensive.
Yeah, it's basically nothing to buy creatine monohydrate and caffeine. And I would like to add that there's been studies comparing monohydrate to other different forms of creatine, creatine ethyl ester, creatinine, and I think there was another study that compared monohydrate to, I can't remember the form of creatine but
I think it might have been creatine HCl or something like that, hydrochloride.
That might be correct. And all of them conclude with the same, that there's basically no benefits of the other creatine forms compared to creatine monohydrate. The papers doesn't say that crealkaline is worse than creatine monohydrate, but you're not really seeing any benefits from using that compare. And there's a huge price difference. The only creatine form that I would stay clear of is creatine ethyl ester. That's actually been shown to convert more to creatinine, which is the byproduct when creatine is broken down, and that's not a good thing because it's taxing on the kidneys. So that's something I would definitely stay clear of. However, I don't have research to back this up, but some of the guys that I have get digestive issues, GI upset from taking monohydrate, and when we've switched them over to crealkaline, which is basically monohydrate and baking soda, they seem to stomach that better. That's the only case scenario where I actually recommend a different form. Is if you're having issues with creatine monohydrate, the first thing that you can do is try to mix it in sufficient amounts of water. So general recommendations is 100 milliliters of water per gram of creatine that you're going to use. And the most important thing with creatine monohydrate, if you're having GI issues, is that it gets diluted in the fluid that you're using. So warm water seems to help with diluting the creatine monohydrate more. It mixes better compared to cold water. So if you're having trouble with the monohydrate, try that first. If that doesn't work, the next option would be to try the other form of creatine and see if your GI agrees better with that. But other than that, I don't see any benefits with the other forms of creatine.
I just chase the creatine monohydrate, just scoop into the mouth and just swig of water and swallow it down. I'm hardcore like that.
Yeah, if that works for you and you don't get any issues from that, you're lucky. I'm unfortunately one of the guys that can't stomach creatine monohydrate. I've tried everything and I just cramp up with the lowest amounts of creatine, and to be honest, it's just not worth it for me. So I haven't used creatine for ages, but I do use caffeine. Citrulline I've actually been using lately, but one thing that you actually forgot to mention is the taste of citrulline malate is horrible. It's
so bitter, right?
Yeah, it's like insane how bitter the taste is. But if you use something that has citrus flavor or something like that, it's not too bad, but it's still it's not delicious, but you get it down.
Whatever it takes.
Yeah, whatever it takes.
Well, thanks so much, Juma, for coming on today and giving your insights. I guess the biggest takeaway probably is that people, they need to take it a lot slower than what they possibly would think. So 10%, 20%, and for the more advanced you are, the higher your training age, the lower that percentage needs to be, or closer to maintenance. And really, we can't force the gains. And I guess just taking it slow and just being consistent and slow enough so that you're able to bulk long enough so that you're not actually cutting, going from cutting to bulking all the time and spending the majority of your time in a bulking phase at that slower progress, like a more of a hare versus kind of a rabbit, or what is it, a tortoise versus a rabbit approach, where you're taking it extremely slow, but you're able to go consistently, rather than saying like, I'm gonna bulk really fast and gain a lot of weight, then I'm gonna cut and then do the whole thing again, and you just end up shooting yourself in the foot.
Yeah, you summed it up perfectly.
Well, again, thanks so much for coming on. Where's the best place that people can find you if they want to reach out to you, or they want to find more about your work?
Our website, iraqnutrition.com, is the only site that we have in English. We also have a lot of infographics that we share on Instagram, Iraqi Nutrition on Instagram, and you can also check us out on Facebook. Unfortunately, my personal page, JUMAIRAKI.com, is only Norwegian content, so I don't think that is of interest to your listeners. But definitely check out our website, IraqNutrition.com, and our social media.
Well, thanks again for coming on today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure to spend an hour plus chatting with you.
So I hope you enjoyed that episode with myself and JUMA IRAKI. And I think that even if you're not a natural competitive bodybuilder, there's definitely some takeaways that you can implement from this paper and from this episode that we talked about. I'm going to link all of JUMA's social profiles, his website, and the paper that we specifically talked about in the show notes, where you can find all of the timestamps as well. But for me personally, what I think I'm going to take away from this is that I'm going to be increasing my protein intake quite a bit higher than I would have traditionally done, and see how that helps me in this transition period into the off season. Because even though I'm eating more calories now, hunger is going to be significantly higher, even if body fat increases. And there was a paper, I think in 2013, looking at hormonal profiles of those who were post-contest, and leptin and ghrelin levels really didn't return back to baseline until about 6 months after the show, even when body fat levels came up a little bit higher. So I'm going to use that higher protein intake to manage my hunger, as well as potentially help bring back some of that lost muscle that I lost essentially towards the end of my contest prep. But again, I hope you enjoyed the show, and if you did, please do go over and leave a rating and review, and share this podcast with anybody who you feel will take some value from it. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to me, and my email is in the show notes, or you can get me on Instagram at AdamMac192. You can just send me a DM there. But I hope to see you in a future episode, and thank you for sticking around.